Did Joe Biden screw up the 2024 election? A lot of Americans are asking themselves this question, and many are claiming that the Democrats lost the 2024 election the day Joe Biden announced he would seek a second term. Although Biden never gave a hard commitment not to seek re-election, he did say during his first run for the presidency in 2020 that he saw himself as a transitional figure. And this statement naturally caused many voters, especially the ones who cast their ballots for him despite concerns over his age and rumors over his mental decline, to garner the false impression that Biden would pass the torch to another Democrat in 4 years, most likely his vice president, Kamala Harris. However, when Biden announced his decision to run for re-election in 2024, many voters were shocked and felt that Biden had reneged on a promise that he had technically never explicitly given them. That said, as we well know, in politics, perception shapes reality. And the reason Biden's decision to run for re-election appears in hindsight to be such a massive miscalculation has to do with the fact that later, he dropped out of the race and handed the task of defeating Donald Trump to his vice president at the 11th hour. 100 days later, we all know what happened.
Hey, look what happened. Is this crazy?
The 2024 election can only be described as an unmitigated disaster for Joe Biden, Kamala Harris, and the entire Democratic Party. And one of the biggest contributing factors to that disaster was the way Biden dropped out of the race and the way Vice President Harris replaced him. But this wasn't the first time a president eligible for a second term decided to leave the presidential race and pass the torch to a different candidate. It happened in 1928, and the President of the United States was Calvin Coolidge. Indeed, President Calvin Coolidge dropped out of the 1928 presidential race, handing the reins over to one of his cabinet secretaries, Herbert Hoover. But unlike Joe Biden, his party's candidate actually won that election and won it in a landslide. In fact, in 1928, Coolidge delivered what I would argue was a master class in how to properly drop out of an election. So in this video, I would like to explore the differences in how two incumbent presidents dropped out of their presidential races and why only one of those, Calvin Coolidge, was able to do it without preventing his party's victory. Welcome everybody to the One Human History channel, where we discuss presidential politics from a historical perspective. My name is Johnny, and if you like the videos that I make here on this channel, I would encourage you to give me a like, a subscribe, go to my channel and watch some of my other great videos where I discuss a range of topics, including some topics that go beyond presidential history and into world history, native history, black history, you name it, I got it. So thanks for tuning in. And let's get into the subject matter. Chapter 1, Exiting Softly. As Joe Biden and Calvin Coolidge neared the times when they would be expected to launch their re-election campaigns, both presidents were at a similar point of physical and mental exhaustion. Biden was 81 years old and obviously struggling to keep up with the physical demands of his office. Coolidge, too, was on a health decline and was having difficulty mustering up the will to care to be president anymore after the unexpected and tragic death of his son, Calvin Jr. A stark difference, however, is that while Coolidge was intent on finding a way of getting out of being president for 4 more years, Biden was determined to continue on. On April 23rd, 2023, Biden announced his intention to run for a second term with a sleek, high-budget short film that emphasized his energy and vigor. His campaign staff clearly knew that Biden's age would be an issue, if not the issue, of the campaign. And so they decided to confront it head on. However, this decision only created a higher cliff from which Biden would later fall, taking his entire party down with him. Calvin Coolidge took a much different route. In 1927, during a summer vacation, I think in North Dakota, but I can't remember exactly, somewhere out there, he was out fishing and enjoying nature, Coolidge gathered a group of reporters into a nearby high school gym for an announcement regarding the 1928 election. Initially, this even created a buzz about this being potentially an official announcement press conference in which Coolidge would tell the reporters he intended to run for re-election. However, when reporters arrived, the president handed each of them a note. The note simply read, "I do not choose to run for re-election in 1928. Much like Biden's promise to be a transitional president, Coolidge's announcement that he would not choose to run wasn't a firm commitment to drop out. However, it was quickly understood by the public to mean exactly that. And so what ensued next was a robust contest within the Republican Party for a new candidate in 1928. By having a primary, the 1928 Republican Party was able to provide American voters with the time and space to get to know and choose a new candidate. It gave the party an opportunity to build enthusiasm, what we might call today buzz, around the chosen candidate, which would help them enter the election season with a tailwind. That buzz primarily swarmed around Coolidge's Secretary of Commerce, Herbert Hoover. By going through the primary process, Hoover was able to enter the 1928 race on the heels of victory, carrying a well-earned mandate from his party's voters. Now remember, President Coolidge didn't have to do it this way. He could have made different decisions that would have squandered this important advantage, but he didn't. And that goes to Chapter 2, Passing the Torch Smoothly. When Coolidge dropped out in 1928, American voters immediately knew who his likely successor was going to be. Herbert Hoover was the superstar of the Coolidge administration, an orphan from the cornfields of Iowa who grew to become one of the wealthiest and most successful mining engineers in the world. He was more famous than any current figure in the president's orbit. He had won admiration for his incredible relief programs during and after World War I, which helped feed the starving victims of the war and saved millions of lives. Coolidge could have easily said, "I'm dropping out and I endorse Hoover." But the fact that he didn't is key to how Coolidge pulled off the perfect exit. By keeping his mouth shut, something Coolidge was famous for in general, he allowed Hoover to make his own case for the presidency and compete on an even playing field with the many other candidates who chose to run that year. At the same time, Hoover was able to convey to the public that he was willing to serve, but he wasn't overly ambitious for the job. One exchange between Secretary Hoover and President Coolidge is incredibly illustrative. As the Iowa primary approached, Hoover asked President Coolidge if he was going to be appearing on the ballot. Coolidge responded, "No." Hoover asked, "Should I enter the primary then?" Coolidge responded, "Why not?" Really shows a big contrast in terms of Coolidge's hands-off approach versus Biden's. Biden dropped out in the summer of 2024 after his disastrous debate performance against Donald Trump and a concentrated pressure campaign from celebrities and party elites to push him out of the race. However you feel about Biden exiting the race and whether it was, an example of him being like George Washington and dropping out for the good of the country, or a conspiracy to push him out, or somewhere in between, you have to at least admit and agree with me that the way Biden dropped out of the race could not, by any metric, be considered a success for the Democratic Party. It happened late in the election season. It threw the Democrats into chaos at a time when they needed to show unity more than ever. And it was that last consideration over unity that led Biden to make a hasty decision and quickly endorse the candidacy of his vice president, Kamala Harris. Unlike Herbert Hoover, Harris entered her race without the benefits of having earned her spot through a primary process. Harris fever, if such a thing even exists at all, could not be built up over a year of sustained campaigning, which led into the party conventions. Instead, Harris became the candidate overnight, taking all the delegates and all the money with her, marching out onto the campaign stage as if she was the people's favorite. All of this contributed to an image of Harris as a usurper. Now, I'm not saying she was a usurper. I'm not saying she wasn't a usurper, but I'm trying to show you the way that perception shapes reality. How the way it looked was part of why it didn't work. By contrast, Hoover was not only able to demonstrate his merit on the field of battle against other candidates, but he also constantly made these gestures which signaled to the public that while he was willing to be the candidate, he was also willing to step aside should Calvin Coolidge change his mind. Hoover didn't give any speeches, he didn't engage in any campaign events. In fact, on one occasion, at a point when Hoover had actually garnered 400 delegates for the nomination out of the 537 he needed, he approached President Coolidge and asked him if the president wanted to just take them. He handed them to President Coolidge on a silver platter and said, "Here, 400 votes. Do you want them?" Coolidge's answer was characteristically terse. "If you have 400 delegates, I think you ought to keep them." You really gotta admire Coolidge in this regard, you know? I mean, what a guy. Chapter 3, Staying Out of the Way. The final difference between Biden and Coolidge can be seen in how the two incumbent presidents behaved during the campaign season after they dropped out of the race. Obviously, those of you who know about Calvin Coolidge, who know that his nickname was Silent Cal, can probably guess what Coolidge did once Hoover was the nominee. He endorsed him and kept his mouth shut for the rest of the election. Brilliant. Just freaking brilliant. This allowed Hoover to be the star of his own election campaign and not the former president. Coolidge wasn't hanging over the election like some sort of ghost. His record wasn't constantly weighing Herbert Hoover down, and he wasn't making gaffes on the campaign trail or saying things that hurt his party's candidates' chances. And so throughout the election, Herbert Hoover fever really took over the public, and the candidate was even able to garner some crucial endorsements from figures like Thomas Edison and Henry Ford and even a bunch of celebrities. His optimistic campaign matched the tenor of the times. Coolidge was a popular president, the economy was strong, Coolidge seemed more than satisfied with Hoover being the candidate, seemed like Hoover was poised for a landslide, and that is exactly what happened. Biden's participation in the 2024 election campaign, however, created nothing but headaches for Kamala Harris. In fact, it seemed that every time Biden opened his mouth, Harris's numbers went down. Whether it was his bizarre decision to wear a MAGA hat at a town hall, or holding a press conference during Harris's rally at the Washington Monument, or his comment about Trump rallies being plagued with human garbage days before the election,
the only garbage I see floating out there is his supporters.
Biden would have done well to take the example of Silent Cal. Drop out and stay the heck out of the way. I wonder what impact Donald Trump, who is also a big talker, will have on the next Republican nominee's race for the White House. Maybe you can write about that in the comments. Time will tell. In the end, it's important to remember that no two elections can ever be compared one-to-one. There are always a million things about each election that makes it different from any other, and just because Coolidge dropped out the way that he did and Hoover then got elected, doesn't mean Harris or a different candidate would have won in 2024 had Biden chosen not to run from the start. But when I look at these two cases, I'm just so astonished by how much more productive, constructive Coolidge's approach to exiting the race was for Herbert Hoover, how much more it helped him cruise to victory, and how much damage Biden's approach did for Harris. And in that spirit, I'd like to end the video with a great quote from our 30th president, Calvin Coolidge, and one that any future president who is thinking about running for re-election should have framed and hanging on the Oval Office wall. "It is much better not to want to run and have them want you to than it is to want to run and them not want you to." So thanks everybody for tuning in today. This was a short video idea I had recently as I was reading a fantastic book about Herbert Hoover, a Herbert Hoover biography. That would be kind of cool, like a vibes-based biography. Anyway, a biography of Herbert Hoover, which I'll put a link to in the comments. I recommend it. I'm listening to it on Audible. And as I was just listening to the story about Calvin Coolidge's exit, it just immediately came to me that, like, man, you know, there is actually a correct way to not run for re-election without damaging your party. And if you're a Democrat and a Harris supporter, then unfortunately, In my estimation, Biden and his actions and his approach, if it didn't guarantee Harris's loss, like maybe Harris was going to lose anyway, or maybe Harris could have won, but for Biden, it didn't help. And nobody should ever want to go into an election under the circumstances that Biden created because of his approach to this issue. So, if you ever run for president and you get elected and you're thinking about re-election, please, please, please consider how you exit the race and try to do it in a manner that allows your party to democratically nominate a candidate. It can only improve your chances of defeating your opponent. Well, by the time we see each other again on this channel, we will have a new president, and I hope that you continue to stick around because we will be occasionally discussing some of the things that our new president will do and trying to put them in historical context, as we always do here on the One Human History channel. Thanks, everybody. Have a great day.